The moment they handed me a seat assignment next to the kitchen doors, I realized two things. Someone wanted me embarrassed, and someone had badly underestimated who I was. My name is Emily Carter, and on the night of the Harrison Foundation Charity Gala, I arrived expecting a formal evening of speeches, fundraising, and polite conversation. What I did not expect was to watch a smiling event coordinator glance at my name tag, hesitate for half a second, and then escort me past rows of beautifully decorated tables occupied by executives, politicians, celebrities, and major donors. We walked farther and farther from the stage until the sound of clattering dishes began replacing the soft music from the ballroom. My assigned table sat beside a pair of swinging kitchen doors. Every few seconds, waiters carrying trays hurried in and out. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread drifted through the air. It was impossible to miss what had happened. Someone had decided that was exactly where I belonged. I thanked the coordinator anyway and took my seat. Years earlier, I might have felt humiliated. That version of me no longer existed. Around the room, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of guests dressed in expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. Laughter echoed across the ballroom. A giant screen displayed photographs celebrating the foundation's achievements. Most people seemed thrilled to be there. I quietly adjusted my silver bracelet and watched. Observation had become one of my greatest strengths. It did not take long to notice the curious looks. A few guests recognized my name. Others seemed unsure why I was attending. One woman at a nearby table whispered something to her husband while glancing in my direction. He turned, looked at me, then quickly looked away. Interesting. Very interesting. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server and smiled politely. Then I saw a familiar face across the room. Ryan Whitmore. Even from 50 feet away, I recognized the confident posture, the expensive tailored suit, and the expression of a man who believed every room belonged to him. 5 years had passed since our divorce, yet I could still predict the way he would react when he noticed me. Sure enough, his eyes found mine. Surprise flashed across his face for a fraction of a second before being replaced by amusement. He leaned toward the blonde woman standing beside him and said something that made her laugh. She followed his gaze directly to me. Whatever Ryan had told her, she clearly found it entertaining. I looked away first, not because I felt defeated, but because I genuinely did not care. That seemed to confuse people more than anger ever could. As the ballroom continued filling, another strange detail caught my attention. Several members of the foundation's board had entered through a side door near the stage. One after another, they scanned the crowd. Instead of looking toward the VIP tables, they looked toward the back of the room. Toward me. One elderly board member even gave a small nod before taking his seat. Most people missed it. I didn't. And neither, judging by the crease forming on Ryan's forehead, did he. Ryan did not wait long before making his move. I saw him excuse himself from his table and begin walking across the ballroom with the easy confidence of someone who believed every conversation would go exactly the way he planned. The blonde woman followed close behind, her hand resting lightly on his arm. As they approached, several nearby guests turned their attention toward us. Apparently, Ryan Whitmore still knew how to attract an audience. He stopped beside my table and smiled. It was the same smile that had once charmed investors, reporters, and board members. Tonight it felt rehearsed. "Emily," he said, "I almost did not recognize you." I looked up calmly. "Hello, Ryan." His companion tilted her head slightly. "So this is Emily?" she asked. Ryan laughed softly. "The one and only." Something about the way he said it made a few people nearby smile. The woman extended her hand. "I am Chloe Bennett. Ryan has told me so much about you." I shook her hand politely. "I hope only the good parts." Ryan chuckled. There were not many of those. A couple sitting at the neighboring table laughed a little too eagerly. I noticed Chloe glance toward my seat assignment. Her eyes widened. Slightly. "Oh," she said. "I did not realize they seated guests back here." Ryan followed her gaze toward the kitchen doors. "Well, I suppose the event planners know what they are doing." More laughter. Small. Controlled. Designed to sound harmless. I took a sip of water instead of responding. That seemed to disappoint Ryan. He had always preferred reactions. Silence made him uncomfortable. "You know," he continued, "this foundation has grown tremendously over the years. The guest list is far more selective now." Chloe nodded. "Some people would not even recognize half the names in this room." I smiled. "That is possible. Ryan studied my face carefully, searching for embarrassment. When he did not find any, he changed tactics. "So what brings you here tonight?" he asked. "Professional curiosity," I replied. "I like seeing how things evolve." His expression tightened for just a moment. Then he laughed again. "Well, you certainly picked an interesting seat for observation." Before I could answer, a waiter carrying champagne passed by. The waiter nearly stopped when he noticed me. His eyes widened slightly. Then he straightened his posture and offered a respectful nod before continuing toward the stage area. Ryan saw it. I knew he did because his smile faded for half a second. Chloe missed it entirely. "Honestly," she said, lowering her voice, "if I had been assigned this table, I would have complained immediately." I glanced toward the ballroom entrance. More board members were arriving. One of them looked directly at me and gave a warm smile before taking his seat. Another quietly raised a hand in greeting. Ryan noticed that too. This time he could not hide his confusion. "Do you know some of these people?" Chloe asked. "A few," I answered. Ryan folded his arms. "Interesting." For the first time that evening, he no longer looked amused. He looked curious. And curiosity, I knew from experience, was always the first crack in Ryan Whitmore's confidence. After Ryan and Chloe finally returned to their table, the atmosphere around me changed in a way that was difficult to explain. Nothing obvious happened. No announcement was made. No one came over to introduce themselves. Yet I could feel attention shifting. People were watching without appearing to watch. Conversations paused when I stood to collect a fresh glass of water. Eyes followed me as I returned to my seat. Ryan noticed it too. Every few minutes, I caught him looking in my direction. At first, he seemed merely curious. Then he became distracted. Then uneasy. The gala officially began 20 minutes later. A master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the Harrison Foundation's annual fundraising event. The giant screens lit up with photographs from scholarship programs, community projects, and medical research grants. Applause filled the ballroom. I joined him politely. Across the room, Ryan sat at one of the premier tables near the stage. Chloe seemed completely relaxed. Ryan did not. During the opening presentation, an elderly gentleman approached my table. I recognized him immediately. Charles Donnelly had served on the foundation board for nearly 2 decades. He was respected by everyone in the room. Instead of taking an empty seat nearby, he stopped beside me. "Emily," he said warmly, "it is good to see you again." "Good to see you too, Charles." His smile widened. "It has been far too long." We exchanged a few brief words before he returned to the front of the ballroom. The interaction lasted less than a minute. It was enough. Several nearby guests suddenly looked at me very differently. One woman who had ignored me all evening now offered a polite smile. Another guest leaned toward his wife and whispered something while glancing at Charles. The questions were spreading. Who was I? Why did a senior board member seem genuinely pleased to see me? Why was I sitting beside the kitchen? I could practically hear those questions moving through the room. A few minutes later, another familiar face appeared. Margaret Holloway. She chaired one of the foundation's largest fundraising committees. Margaret crossed half the ballroom to greet me. She squeezed my hand and asked about my family. Then she laughed and said, "Some people are going to be very surprised tonight." Before I could respond, she caught herself and smiled. "Enjoy the evening, Emily." Then she walked away. I noticed Ryan staring at her retreating figure. His expression had become impossible to hide. Chloe followed his gaze. "What is going on?" she asked. Ryan shook his head. "I do not know." For the first time all evening, there was no confidence in his voice. The presentation continued, but the room no longer felt the same. Even the servers seemed unusually attentive whenever they approached my table. One young waiter accidentally called me ma'am with a level of respect normally reserved for major donors. He immediately looked embarrassed, as though he had revealed something he should not have. That caught my attention. Then it happened again. A second staff member addressed me the same way. Small details. Tiny cracks in a much larger secret. I looked toward the stage where the evening schedule was displayed on a large screen. Opening remarks. Scholarship awards. Recognition ceremony. Special announcement. My eyes lingered on those final 2 words. Special announcement. Across the ballroom, Ryan followed my gaze to the screen. For a brief moment, our eyes met. And for the first time since I arrived, he looked genuinely worried. As the scholarship awards began, I found myself thinking about how easily history can be rewritten when enough time passes. 5 years earlier, Nearly everyone in that ballroom would have known exactly who I was. Back then, my father, William Carter, rarely attended public events without introducing me as his partner in every major project. He believed that if you built something meaningful, you should never hide the people who helped create it. The Harrison Foundation had started as a small regional charity with a simple mission. Over the years, it expanded into a nationally recognized organization supporting education, medical research, and community development. My father spent decades building its reputation, and I spent more than 10 years helping him grow it. I attended donor meetings, reviewed proposals, traveled across the country visiting programs, and worked behind the scenes on countless initiatives that never made headlines. My name was never the most visible one in the room, but it was always there. Then life changed. My father passed away unexpectedly. The loss shattered me in ways I could never fully explain. Around the same time, my marriage to Ryan began falling apart. Grief has a way of revealing truths people spend years hiding. The man I thought I knew became someone else entirely. By the time our divorce was finalized, I no longer wanted interviews, public recognition, or social events. I stepped away. The newspapers stopped mentioning me. New donors arrived. New executives joined the organization. Year after year, fewer people remembered the woman who had once been involved in nearly every major decision. That was exactly how I wanted it. Privacy became a luxury I valued more than attention. Meanwhile, Ryan's career accelerated. He learned how to speak confidently in front of cameras. He learned how to impress investors and network with influential people. Eventually, many people began associating him with circles of power he had never actually helped build. I never corrected them. Tonight was the first time I had seen the consequences of that silence so clearly. Across the ballroom, Ryan was speaking with several guests, but his attention kept drifting back toward me. The uncertainty on his face continued growing. He remembered my history with the foundation. He knew things most people in the room did not. That knowledge was making him uncomfortable. A few minutes later, another board member approached my table. This time it was Richard Lawson, the foundation's legal counsel. Richard rarely attended public functions unless something important was happening. He shook my hand warmly and smiled. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned," he said quietly. "Good," I replied. "Then there is nothing to worry about." Richard nodded and returned to the front of the ballroom. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Ryan saw every moment of it. Chloe noticed his reaction immediately. "You know him too?" she asked. Ryan did not answer right away. He stared at Richard crossing the room before finally speaking. "Yes," he said slowly. "I know who he is." Chloe laughed nervously. "Then why do you suddenly look like you have seen a ghost?" Ryan's eyes drifted toward the stage where staff members were preparing for the next segment of the evening. "Because," he said quietly, "I think there is something happening tonight that nobody told me about." The tension in the ballroom became impossible to ignore after that. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, but people could sense that something unusual was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the evening. The fundraising presentations continued, and guests applauded generously as large donation totals appeared on the screens. Normally, this was the part of the gala where attention focused entirely on the stage. Tonight, attention seemed divided. Every few minutes, someone else found a reason to approach my table. A longtime donor stopped to say hello. A former scholarship recipient recognized me and thanked me for advice I had given her years earlier. Even members of the event staff seemed unusually careful whenever they spoke to me. None of these interactions were remarkable on their own. Together, they created a pattern that was becoming difficult for others to ignore. Across the room, Ryan had stopped pretending everything was normal. He remained seated, but I could see him speaking quietly with Chloe. She looked confused. He looked concerned. At one point, he pulled out his phone and typed several messages. Whatever answers he expected to receive clearly were not arriving. A few minutes later, the chairman of the board, Leonard Graves, entered the ballroom. That alone attracted attention. Leonard rarely attended public events unless the matter was important. He was one of the most influential figures connected to the foundation and one of the few people whose arrival could instantly change the mood of a room. As he made his way through the crowd, guests stood to greet him. Donors shook his hand. Sponsors welcomed him warmly. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of heading toward the front tables reserved for senior leadership, Leonard changed direction and walked straight toward the back of the ballroom. Straight toward me. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Even the servers appeared to notice. Leonard reached my table and smiled. It was not the polite smile he used for donors or business associates. It was the smile of someone greeting a trusted friend. "Emily," he said warmly. "Thank you for being here tonight." "I would not have missed it," I replied. "Good," he said. "It would not have been the same without you." Then, to the surprise of nearly everyone watching, Leonard pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down. The chairman of the board spent nearly 10 minutes talking with me while dozens of guests watched from across the ballroom. I could feel the shock spreading through the room. Ryan certainly felt it. His face had gone completely still. The confidence that defined him earlier in the evening had been replaced by calculation. He was trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. Chloe leaned toward him repeatedly, asking questions. He barely responded. When Leonard finally stood to leave, he placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Everything is ready," he said. "Excellent," I answered. "Then let us begin when the time comes." Leonard nodded and returned toward the stage area. The moment he left, the room erupted into whispers. People were no longer wondering whether I mattered. They were trying to understand how much. I glanced toward the large screen above the stage. The current presentation was ending. Staff members were moving equipment into position. A new slide appeared displaying only 4 words. "Special announcement coming up next." Around me, curiosity filled the air. Across the room, Ryan stared at those words as if they carried a threat only he could see. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the final fundraising segment came to an end. Conversations faded into silence. Every guest turned toward the stage. The large screen behind the podium displayed the foundation logo while staff members moved with unusual urgency near the curtains. Even from the back of the room, I could feel anticipation building. Leonard Graves stepped onto the stage first. The chairman rarely handled announcements personally, which immediately caught everyone's attention. A ripple of curiosity spread across the audience. Leonard waited patiently until the room became completely quiet. Then he smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we conclude this evening, the board would like to recognize an individual whose impact on this foundation cannot be measured by donations, titles, or public recognition." I saw Ryan straighten in his chair. Chloe leaned forward. Several guests glanced around the room, trying to guess who Leonard was referring to. "Many of you know the Harrison Foundation as one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country," Leonard continued. "What fewer people know is that some of the most important decisions that shaped our growth happened behind the scenes." The screen changed. Old photographs appeared. Images from charity projects, scholarship ceremonies, and community programs flashed one after another. I recognized many of them. They represented years of work, years most people had forgotten. Around the ballroom, guests studied the images carefully. Some faces looked familiar. Others belonged to people who had long since retired. Then a photograph appeared showing my father standing beside a younger version of me at the opening of one of our earliest education initiatives. A murmur swept through the room. Ryan's expression changed instantly. He knew that photograph. I could see recognition in his eyes. Leonard continued speaking. 5 years ago, after a personal tragedy, one of the most important figures in our history chose to step away from public life. Out of respect for that decision, the board honored her privacy. The room grew quieter with every word. "Tonight," Leonard said, "we believe it is time to acknowledge the truth." Across the ballroom, I noticed several board members stand. Then several more followed. The movement immediately drew attention. Guests looked confused. Chloe turned toward Ryan. "What is happening?" she whispered. Ryan did not answer. His eyes never left the stage. Leonard reached into his jacket and removed a sealed envelope. The gesture felt ceremonial, deliberate. Every person in the room seemed to stop breathing. "This foundation exists today because of vision, sacrifice, and leadership that most people never saw," Leonard said. The board unanimously agreed that the individual responsible deserves proper recognition. He opened the envelope. The sound of paper unfolding echoed through the silent ballroom. I watched Ryan's face lose what little confidence remained. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely afraid of what might come next. Leonard glanced down at the document, then looked back up at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "please join me in welcoming the sole owner and principal steward of the Harrison Foundation." Every eye in the ballroom fixed on the stage. Then Leonard spoke the name that froze the room completely. Emily Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt as though the entire ballroom had forgotten how to breathe. Hundreds of faces turned toward the back of the room where I was seated beside the kitchen doors. The same seat assignment that had seemed like an insult less than 2 hours earlier suddenly became the most talked-about location in the building. I remained seated for a moment, allowing reality to settle over the crowd. The expressions around me were impossible to ignore. Surprise, confusion, disbelief, curiosity. Some guests immediately began whispering to one another. Others stared openly. A few people who had greeted me warmly earlier simply smiled, as though they had been waiting all night for this exact moment. Across the ballroom, Chloe looked completely stunned. Her eyes moved from the stage to me and back again, as if she were trying to determine whether she had heard correctly. Then she turned toward Ryan. He did not react, at least not immediately. He sat perfectly still, his face drained of color, his attention locked on the stage. I knew what he was thinking because I had seen that expression only once before. Years ago, when he realized he had made a very expensive mistake during a business negotiation. It was the look of a man rapidly recalculating everything he believed to be true. Leonard waited respectfully while the room absorbed the announcement. Then he smiled toward me and extended his hand. "Emily," he said, "would you please join us?" The invitation broke the spell. One board member stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire board of directors was on its feet. Applause began near the stage and spread across the ballroom. It started politely. Then it grew louder, stronger, more sincere. Guests who only moments earlier had been whispering now rose from their chairs. I stood slowly and adjusted my gown. The kitchen doors swung open behind me as servers hurried through, completely unaware that they had become part of the evening's most ironic image. The woman assigned to the least desirable table in the room was suddenly the person everyone wanted to see. As I began walking toward the stage, people moved aside instinctively. Several guests offered congratulations. Others introduced themselves even though the moment was clearly not about them. I thanked them politely and continued forward. Meanwhile, Ryan remained frozen in place. Chloe leaned toward him and spoke urgently. I could not hear her words, but I could see the panic growing on her face. Ryan finally responded. He shook his head once. Then again. Whatever explanation he was searching for, he was not finding it. Halfway to the stage, another realization appeared to strike him. His eyes widened. The concern that had been building all evening suddenly transformed into something much worse. Understanding. Ryan knew exactly what ownership of the foundation meant. He knew where major funding decisions originated. He knew which organizations depended on those relationships. Most importantly, he knew how many people in his professional network respected the institution standing behind me. The problem was not that I was important. The problem was that I was far more important than anyone in the room had realized. By the time I reached the stage stairs, the applause had become thunderous. Leonard offered his hand to help me onto the platform. I accepted it and turned toward the audience. The room that had once looked at me with indifference was now standing in complete silence, waiting to hear what I would say next. The ballroom became completely silent as I stepped behind the podium. Hundreds of people were watching. Some looked curious. Others looked embarrassed. A few appeared, shocked that they had spent most of the evening overlooking someone they now realized held more influence than many of the people seated at the front tables. I understood their reaction. The truth was that I had spent years allowing others to underestimate me. Leonard stepped aside and gave me the stage. I thanked him with a small nod before looking out across the room. My eyes briefly passed over Ryan and Chloe. Neither looked away. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "Thank you for being here tonight. More importantly, thank you for supporting the mission that has guided this foundation for decades." The room remained perfectly still. When people hear stories about successful organizations, they often imagine dramatic moments, major announcements, or influential leaders standing in front of cameras. The reality is usually much simpler. Most meaningful work happens quietly. It happens through thousands of small decisions made by people who expect nothing in return. Several guests nodded. Others listened carefully. My father taught me that service is not about recognition. It is about responsibility. He believed that if you are fortunate enough to build something valuable, your job is to leave it stronger than you found it. The large screen behind me displayed photographs from programs funded by the foundation over the years. Scholarship recipients, medical researchers, community leaders, real people whose lives had changed because someone chose to help. 5 years ago, I continued, I stepped away from public life. It was the right decision at the time. The foundation continued growing, and many talented people helped move it forward. Tonight is not about me. It is about the mission we share. The audience responded with warm applause. Then I noticed movement near Ryan's table. Several guests who had spent the evening speaking with him were now asking questions. I could not hear them, but I could see the growing discomfort on his face. The announcement had triggered conversations he clearly had not expected. People were connecting pieces of information, remembering old photographs, recalling meetings from years ago, understanding relationships they had never fully understood before. The realization was spreading through the room. I continued speaking calmly. One lesson life has taught me is that titles can be impressive, but character matters more. Wealth can open doors, but integrity determines what happens after those doors open. Recognition can come and go, but respect is earned one decision at a time. That line seemed to resonate deeply. Applause erupted again. I was not attacking anyone. I was not calling anyone out. Yet the message landed exactly where it needed to. Sometimes the truth requires no additional explanation. As the applause faded, Leonard handed me a folder containing several documents. I opened it and smiled. Before I leave the stage, I said, I would like to share one more piece of news. The audience immediately focused on me again. After months of preparation, the foundation is launching a new national initiative that will provide educational opportunities and research grants across multiple states. It represents one of the largest projects in our history. Excitement spread through the room. Donors leaned forward. Board members exchanged smiles. Then I added one final detail. The program has already been fully funded. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, applause, astonishment. Across the ballroom, Ryan lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time all evening, he looked like a man who finally understood how much he had misunderstood. The applause continued for nearly a full minute after I announced the new initiative. What began as polite appreciation transformed into genuine excitement. Donors were smiling. Board members were shaking hands. Reporters seated near the side of the ballroom were already taking notes. The energy in the room had completely changed. Earlier that evening, many guests had viewed the gala as another annual fundraising event. Now they were witnessing the beginning of something much larger. I thanked the audience one final time and stepped away from the podium. The standing ovation that followed surprised even me. I looked across the ballroom and saw people rising from every table. Some had supported the foundation for years. Others were attending for the first time. In that moment, none of it mattered. They were not standing because of a title. They were standing because they believed in what the foundation represented. As I stepped down from the stage, dozens of guests moved forward to greet me. Longtime donors congratulated me. Community leaders thanked me for continuing the mission. Former scholarship recipients shared stories about how the foundation had changed their lives. Every conversation reminded me why my father had dedicated so much of his life to this work. Success was never measured by headlines or recognition. It was measured by impact. Across the room, Ryan remained seated. He was no longer the center of attention. The conversations that had once surrounded him were happening elsewhere now. People were speaking about the future of the foundation, the new initiative, and the opportunities it would create. Nobody was being rude to him. Nobody was excluding him. The evening had simply moved on. That was the reality Ryan struggled to understand. Influence built on appearances can disappear quickly. Influence built on trust tends to last much longer. Eventually, I saw him stand. Chloe followed beside him. Their expressions were subdued. Gone were the confidence and amusement they had displayed earlier. They quietly made their way toward the ballroom exit. As they passed nearby, Ryan stopped for a moment. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small nod. It was not an apology. It was something simpler. Recognition. An acknowledgement that the assumptions he had made about me had been wrong. I returned the nod politely. There was no anger left to carry. Life had already delivered the lesson more effectively than I ever could have. Ryan and Chloe continued toward the exit and disappeared through the ballroom doors. I never saw them again that evening. Hours later, as the gala came to a close, The final donation totals exceeded every expectation. Volunteers celebrated. Donors pledged additional support. Board members spoke enthusiastically about the future. The atmosphere felt hopeful. Before leaving, I walked back toward the rear of the ballroom. The table beside the kitchen was still there, exactly where it had been all night. I smiled when I saw it. Earlier, that seat had been intended as a reminder of where some people believed I belonged. Instead, it had become a reminder of something far more important. Never assume you understand someone's worth based on where they are sitting. The people who make the biggest difference are often the ones receiving the least attention. As I prepared to leave, I looked around the nearly empty ballroom one final time. My father used to say that character reveals itself when nobody is watching. That night, I learned another truth. Character also reveals itself when everyone is watching. And in the end, respect is not demanded. It is earned, quietly, consistently, and one decision at a time.